WCW was, for a period during the 90s, one of the top wrestling promotions in the entire world. And even today, decades after its demise, it stands as one of the biggest there ever was. But there was a reason it ultimately went out of business, and part of that reason was because, for as many great things the company did, there were just as many bad ideas. But which were the worst moments in WCW history? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now, starting with the finger poke of doom. Yes, if we're going to start somewhere, then we may as well start with one of the biggest failures of all, the moment many people consider to be the true jumping the shark segment for World Championship Wrestling. Why is that? Well, throughout 1998, the cracks had begun to show for WCW as WWF got massively popular with the rise of Stone Cold Steve Austin. All while down in Atlanta, they were continuing to beat the increasingly dead horse that was the NWO. Luckily for WCW, though, they had an ace in the hole, and that ace in the hole was Bill Goldberg. Unfortunately, though, at Starrcade in December of 1998, Goldberg had been booked to lose to Kevin Nash and, in the process, not only lose his WCW World title, but also end his undefeated streak. How would the company bounce back from this self-imposed fail? Well, on the subsequent episode of Nitro, Big Sexy would come out to the ring with the gold around his waist, only to then be immediately challenged by a now babyface Hulk Hogan. That's right, Hogan had apparently left the NWO behind and was now fighting on the side of good again, with this being his chance to end that which he'd created. At least that's how it could have played out. In reality, however, what we got was pretty bad, as in the main event of this evening, Nash and Hogan squared off in the ring, and before a fight could break out, the Hulksters simply poked the champ lightly in the chest, with this causing Kev to collapse to the ground as Hogan pinned him 1, 2, 3. What was going on here? Well, it had all been a ploy to get the belt back on Hulk Hogan as the NWO had reunited once more. And to make this worse, earlier that night, a comment made by Tony Schiavone on the commentary booth designed to bury the idea that Mick Foley was going to win the WWF title on Raw inadvertently backfired and caused millions of people to tune into that instead. But to be fair, this wasn't the only bad thing that contributed to the demise of WCW. No, there were plenty more bad moments to come after that, with one of the biggest of these being our next entry, the time David Arquette became WCW World Champion. Now, in the lineage of wrestling history, the first ever wrestling world champion was George Hackenschmidt, with him earning this honor after he won it in a shoot fight back in May of 1905. And after that, that lineage of true world champion would carry on to the National Wrestling Alliance, and then eventually World Championship Wrestling too. All of this is to say that while many grew up seeing the likes of Hulk Hogan and Macho Man Randy Savage standing tall with the WWF Championship, many fans at the time still considered the real world champion to be the one who held the one with the lineage that went right back to the start. We are talking about names like Ric Flair, Dusty Rhodes, Terry Funk, and Harley Race, just to name a few. So that's why when in April of 2000, Hollywood actor David Arquette won that belt, it caused such an uproar as it felt like it was an insult to the history of the title. And the reason this one happened was because WCW's booking staff at the time thought that putting the title on a famous Hollywood movie star would attract mainstream audiences to the show. What they didn't realize, though, is that this mainstream attention wouldn't be from people seeing the whole thing play out and loving it, rather it would be from people seeing how ridiculous it all was. And as for people who were already watching the show by then, well, many of them stopped tuning in here as this was a line too far to cross. But again, this was far from the only bad thing WCW did during its dying days. In fact, it's far from the only bad idea they had during that year, as later on in the summer of 2000, they'd give us the ill-fated heel turn of Bill Goldberg. Honestly, if there was one thing World Championship Wrestling still had going for it during the first half of 2000, it would be that, despite some questionable booking, Goldberg was still over and still felt like a star. However, after spending some time away from the ring with an injury, he'd make his return at the Great American Bash on June 11th, where it would be decided that the best thing to do with WCW's top babyface star would be to turn him heel for no apparent reason. And so that's exactly what happened when, towards the end of the show, Bill attacked then babyface Kevin Nash and aligned himself with the powers that be. After all, who wanted to boo Bill Goldberg in 2000? About the same amount of people that wanted to boo Steve Austin in 2001. Obviously then, this had a negative effect on what was left of WCW's fan base by that point, as much of the remaining audience began to tune out. Yes, it's true that Goldberg would turn babyface once more before the year was out, but by that point, the damage was done, with this being yet another contributing factor towards the company ending in March of the following year after being bought out for pennies on the dollar by Vince McMahon. But not every bad WCW decision happened during its latter days. No, some took place a few years earlier than that, before the promotion exploded in popularity, in fact. And it's with this time frame in mind that we come to our next entry, the Dungeon of Doom. What was the Dungeon of Doom? Well, it was a pretty bad attempt to create a stable of heels for Hulk Hogan to overcome once he signed with World Championship Wrestling in 1994. And the reason it was so bad was because, even by the standards of the mid-90s, it was way too cartoonish to take it seriously. Honestly, even if this one had come around at the heights of Hulkamania during the 80s, it might very well have failed. And that's because the ranks of this group were made up of names like the Shark, the Yeti, the Zodiac, and of course the Taskmaster, Kevin Sullivan. It should go without saying then that fans did not take to this one in 1994, especially not fans of a product which had been more traditionally about the old territorial style wrestling. Hell, even when other more significant names like Ming, the Giant, or Big Van Vader were added to the Dungeon of Doom, it wasn't enough to turn around fan sentiment of the stable. No, by then things were too far gone, as their segments held from their secret lair had just left it all a bit too cartoonish to get behind. And things would only get worse for the heel group once Hogan fell to the dark side himself in 1996, as with him now being the leader of the NWO, it left Kevin Sullivan and company with no real purpose anymore. So that was why, after limping on for a little while longer with nothing of note to do and no one wanting to see them on TV anyway, the Dungeon of Doom would fritter away into non-existence in 1998. But what about our next subject? That being the time we saw the story of Last Call Scott Hall. Yes, Scott Hall is someone who very publicly struggled with addiction issues throughout his entire life. So bad were his problems, in fact, that after a while he'd regularly start showing up at TV tapings drunk while working for WCW during the late 90s. But at least the company had the wherewithal to realize there was a problem, right? Well, not exactly. This was 90s wrestling we were talking about after all. And so rather than get the help he needed, the bad guy's problems were allowed to get worse and worse. Sure, Eric Bischoff did try to send him to rehab at least once, but when that didn't work, WCW's booking team decided the next best thing was simply to make it all a part of Hall's on-screen character. And that's how we got the gimmick of Last Call Scott Hall. That's right, during his latter days in WCW, Hall would work a gimmick where whenever he had a match, he'd come out to the ring with a drink in hand, clearly inebriated and in no condition to perform. And this has since gone down as one of the most controversial gimmicks in wrestling history, as it's been called tasteless by many fans. But not every bad WCW idea from back during the late 90s was so tied up in the real-life struggles of someone. No, some were far more comic book in their nature and comparatively harmless, such as the time Ric Flair went insane and got put into an asylum. No, you didn't hear us wrong. Back during the spring of 1999 when, upon realizing they were continuing to lose ground to WWF in the Monday Night Wars, World Championship Wrestling decided that a bold new angle was what was needed to turn the ship around, and that bold new angle would be pretty bad. What was so awful about it? Well, as we mentioned a moment ago, it involved taking Ric Flair, beating heart of the promotion, 16-time plus world champion, and one of the greatest wrestlers to ever lace up a pair of boots, and turning him into what was effectively an extra from One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Honestly, this one has to be seen to be believed, and the reason it happened was because, in the storyline, Roddy Piper was trying to wrangle control of the presidency of WCW away from the Nature Boy, and thought that the best way to do this would be to get him committed against his will. Yes, the following week on Nitro, we'd all be treated to a number of skits involving Slick Rick in his new home, with it being at that point that we'd be introduced to his new friends, a bunch of guys in hospital gowns who looked like they were having the time of their lives dancing around the ward with Flair. And as if that wasn't strange enough, this series of skits would also inexplicably include Scott Hall at one point as another apparent patient in the ward. How would it all end? Well, Rick got out pretty easily enough in the end, despite his apparent incarceration, and that would all lead to him losing the presidency to Hot Rod during a one-on-one match between the pair at Slamboree on May 9th, 1999. But Ric Flair's time as an inpatient may still not be as unfortunate as our next entry, as it's now time to talk about Bret Hart's ill-fated WCW run. Come on now, how do you take Bret Hart, someone who was never more over than he was towards the end of 1997 following the events of the Montreal Screwjob, add him to your roster, and then proceed to do nothing with him? Sure, there's the argument which Eric Bischoff has put forward in the years since that all of Bret's passion was gone by the time he went down to Atlanta, and so there was simply nothing that could be done with him anymore. But even if this were true, the Hitman was also made to look foolish upon joining the company, as his first big moment, which happened during the main event of Starrcade 1997, was majorly botched. And then after this, he'd go on to do little of note for the entirety of 1998 and most of 1999. Yes, an attempt would later be made to rectify things when Bret Hart won the WCW World title in late 1999, but by that point the damage was already done. And it certainly didn't help that come the beginning of 2000, a severe head injury picked up in a match against Bill Goldberg would end up leading towards the Hitman being forced to hang up his boots once and for all. Yes, this one was a real shame, as there was so much potential for greatness in a Bret Hart WCW run. In the end though, things just never worked out. But let's move away from the men for a moment and on to the women instead, as they were involved in plenty of bad WCW ideas over the years too, with one of the worst of these being the time that Miss Hancock underwent a pretty awful pregnancy angle in 2000. Yes, after spending the first part of her WCW run as one of the Nitro Girls, Stacy Keebler became an all-new character in 2000, where she was going by the name of Miss Hancock, a woman who looked like she was straight out of the accounting department of a gentleman's club, and who loved nothing more than to distract wrestlers in the ring during matches by getting on top of the announce table and doing a dance. Needless to say then, this character was a big hit with the audience, so feeling like they needed to give Miss Hancock more screen time, WCW booked her to have an on-screen relationship with her at the time real-life boyfriend David Flair, and this eventually led to the shocking announcement in August of that year that she was pregnant. But while the natural assumption here would be that David Flair was the father, that would not necessarily be the case. And so began several weeks of the son of the Nature Boy angrily trying to find out who might have impregnated his girl, all while he was preparing for their on-screen wedding. Yes, we know this kind of stuff happened a lot during the Attitude Era, but usually when WWF did it, it was at least entertaining. Here though, what we got was all the worst of WCW's booking in action. And it wasn't even as if the whole thing had a good payoff, because after disappearing from TV for a while, Hancock would return in March of 2001 to reveal that there was no baby at all. Or at least we think that's what she was revealing. In truth, the whole thing was just dropped with no real explanation, and with the only reference to her prior pregnancy being the baby carriage filled with 8x10s of her new client, Sean Stasiak. Still, it could have been worse. We could have gotten WCW's original plan of Ric Flair being the secret father of Stacy Keebler's child, so perhaps it's for the best this one got dropped before it could get to that point. And that's not the only bad WCW angle which frittered away into nothing by the time it was all over either. No, the exact same thing could be said about our next subject, the Renegade. Who was the Renegade? Well, maybe it's easier to answer that question by first stating who the Renegade was not, and this was that he was not the Ultimate Warrior. That's right, despite looking like the Warrior and acting just like the Warrior, this gimmick was a total copy of what the real Ultimate Warrior had been doing over in the WWF during the late 80s and early 90s. So why did WCW want you to believe that the Renegade might in fact be the former WWF champion then? Well, they wanted to pop a pay-per-view number. Unfortunately though, back in 1995, the real Ultimate Warrior was not available. And so that's why the Renegade was brought in to be a stand-in for him during the upcoming feud instead. And sure, this wasn't what fans wanted exactly, but it might have been okay had WCW not clearly led them to believe that it was in fact the Ultimate Warrior who was coming in with the way they promoted things ahead of time. Obviously then, when the Renegade showed up as the ultimate surprise at March 19th, 1995's uncensored pay-per-view, this response was not good, either from those in attendance or watching at home. Yes, this was an unbelievable flop, and one which everyone involved no doubt wishes they could erase from history, as there was nothing good which came out of it at all. Hell, it didn't even have that so bad it was good quality, something which was present in our next entry, the tale of Judy Bagwell. That's right, this one goes all the way back to November of 1998. That was when, after his regular tag team partner Kenny Chaos got taken out of action, Rick Steiner decided he needed a new one to fend off the challenge of Scott Steiner and Buff Bagwell. So feeling that the best way to get in the head of at least one of his opponents was to involve family in the matter then, he'd announce on the November 9th episode of Nitro that his new partner was going to be none other than Judy Bagwell. What's more, as Rick and Kenny were the WCW World Tag Team Champions at this point, that meant Chaos's substitute would also be a tag team champion for the night as well, meaning that yes, in the lineage of people who held gold down in Atlanta, there might be a worse example than David Arquette. Sure, she might not have held the belt for long and might not have actually done anything with it, but Judy Bagwell, of all people, was a former WCW Tag Team Champion. Still though, for as stupid as that was, at least this was the end of Mother Bagwell in World Championship Wrestling, right? Well, wrong, because 2 years later, during the hellscape that was WCW 2000, she'd be brought back as a prize to be fought over when Buff and his then rival Chris Kanyon had a Judy Bagwell on a forklift match. No, we're not joking, this actually happened, and it might not even be in the top 10 craziest things WCW did that year. But we're not done with the crazy moments just yet, as our next entry is a doozy, and that's the time the Kiss Demon appeared in the promotion. Now, we're sure you're aware of who Kiss are. After all, they're one of the biggest rock bands of the 70s and 80s, and they had quite a reputation for merchandising themselves to the hills, capitalizing from every opportunity they could. So it shouldn't come as a surprise that seeing the success of WCW during the heights of the Monday Night Wars, Gene Simmons thought it would be a good idea to get involved and promote his band some more at the same time. And that's what led to the creation of the Kiss Demon, a character portrayed by journeyman performer Dale Torborg, who was supposed to act as the in-ring representative of the band. The only problem with this was by the time the turn of the millennium came around, Kiss didn't have exactly the same cachet they once had with audiences, as they were in many ways a relic of the past. So because of that, the idea of the Kiss Demon wrestling inside of a WCW ring didn't meet with the levels of excitement Eric Bischoff had hoped it would. And the whole situation was made even worse by the fact that, as part of the contract between the two parties, any match that the Demon wrestled in would have to be a main event. How would WCW get around this? Well, by just putting the character in mid-card bouts and labeling them as special main events to not have to deal with any legal repercussions. Yes, this one seemed like it was destined to fail right from the get-go. But even if it was relegated to the mid-card, that didn't make the Kiss Demon any better. No, it was still something few people outside of Bischoff and Gene Simmons were interested in during the late 90s. And that's why the planned Warriors of Kiss stable never came to pass, and instead, the whole thing just faded away without any grand storyline. Yes, like with so many things WCW did during its dying days, this one flopped spectacularly. Sure, it didn't exactly cause the company to end or anything, and may have also been a case of something that was so bad it at least had some level of entertainment to it, but added to the pile of bad stuff they were so often creating then, it all created a sense that this show was not essential viewing. Of course, we could say the same about the other examples we've looked at today though, because while World Championship Wrestling did a lot of great things throughout their existence, there was always more than a fair share of bad as well.